Our next speaker is Gretta Vosper. Greta is a Torontonian who advocates a very dramatic rethinking of Christianity. She says the Bible is a human construct and concepts of Jesus and God can and should be thought of as metaphors. She calls her congregation a progressive community of faith growing out of the Christian tradition and has twice narrowly avoided heresy trials. I thought they stopped doing that kind of thing in the Middle Ages, Greta, so come on out here and tell us why you are so dangerous.
Well, I should talk about why I am here, how I got here, and what it is that places me before you today. And part of that will go through some of that heresy trial undertaking. I'm here as someone who has been educated in theology at Queen's Theological College. I took a Master of Divinity degree 20 years ago, almost so long ago I forget the things that I was taught, but I remember the process. And the process was one that engaged my whole brain, just not in the same classes. The left part of my brain was engaged in academic classes about church history, about biblical study, about systematic theology. I learned and was handed the traditions and the scholarship that had come out of the liberal tradition and opened myself to exploring the Bible, to exploring the writings of people who had offered us new ways to understand God, to recognize how the church had developed, what the major doctrinal advances had been and why they had been, the context out of which they had grown, and placed all that on my desk for me to consume. The left part of my brain virtually exploded with delight at this kind of discovery. I had grown up in the United Church, had been one of those first generations that had been offered what was called the new curriculum, a curriculum that did away with the literal understanding of the Bible and taught me that it was about stories about Jesus, this man who had lived and died and tried to make the world a better place. And that if I was going to be a Christian, that was what I was supposed to do. I was supposed to live and die trying to make the world a better place. And so when I got to theological college and I was given all this stuff that helped me refute the literal nature of the Bible and much of the doctrine in which we had been steeped, Christianity had been steeped over time, I was relieved to know that I really just needed to live and die trying to make the world a better place. The right side of my brain, though, was having a different kind of orgasm. Growing up in the United Church of Canada, most of what I was offered was head stuff. And there were other traditions that were offering all kinds of sensual experiences of this mystical thing called God. Candles and colors and gowns with different colored belts and stoles, and dance and music that could be offered into a community setting in ways that I had never imagined, growing up in a staid environment with my minister robed in an academic gown and standing behind a pulpit. And so that orgasm that was going on there was about how to be creative, how to express myself in this rich and environment of inclusivity and beauty, and how I could bring that before the people that I would lead in community settings. Now, those two things didn't actually talk to each other. The left side of the brain with all that academic knowledge didn't actually inform what was going on the right side of the brain, which was just about all that sensual pleasure. And so when I went into ministry, I was doing all this creative stuff, making pageants with fabric and engaging people in all these creative ways of being together. And I was preaching for 15, 20, 25 minutes in the middle of it, telling people what I knew about God, that God was a construct that we had come up with, that we had created it so that we would be able to nail to the door of heaven all these ideals about how we wanted to live, that the Bible was a human construction, that it had been written by people who had the same kind of faults you and I have in different contexts that demanded different ways of looking at it. And so the stories that they wrote reveal who they are. But it's a human construction. It's not literally or divinely even inspired or revealed. It was brought to us by people who struggle in the same ways that we struggle, with different problems and different contexts, but struggle nonetheless. Now, over the course of 1999-2000, I was privileged to engage many of the congregations where I lead in conversations about what their core beliefs were. We were going through kind of a tough time in that group, and so we were wanting to just extend relationships and get people talking about what it was they believed. And while we did that, my colleague and I, who led that, we explored belief with some 22 congregations. At the end of 2 years, when we were finished doing that, we sat down and looked at what it was that we had discovered. And one thing that shone above all others with this glaring beam at us was that unless people in the congregations that we engaged in conversation, unless people in those congregations had been trained theologically as we had, or had been rubbing shoulders with people who had been theologically trained, coffee with their minister on a Saturday morning, working on a national committee where they were engaged with people who had been theologically trained, everyone believed in the same way that they would have been taught to believe in kindergarten. They believed that God was this supernatural being who lived in heaven, that Jesus was his one and only Son, and that he died for our sins, though nobody could really be specific about what that meant. That when we died, we would go to heaven and we would be reconciled with everyone that we'd ever loved in our lives. That's 3 husbands for me. I don't know how that's going to go. But anyway, we carry on. Their beliefs were still encrusted with this understanding of the Bible as a literal thing, and that the doctrine that they had been handed stood the test of time and still held. So what was happening during that 20 minutes when I was preaching every Sunday? Because the things that I had been saying were certainly not that, but nobody got it. I had to figure out why nobody got it. So I went back to my congregation that following Sunday, and we started with the opening prayer, a prayer of approach. A prayer of approach? What were we approaching? And after that, what were we confessing? And after that, who were we praying to and asking to forgive us, or asking to give us the things that we needed, or bring up in us the courage that we needed to face these difficult times? What were we doing in all the rest of that service that wrapped that really truth-filled part in the middle that led people to be so complacent about their faith? It was time to get serious. Now, I really had no intentions of doing that immediately, but one of the Sundays after that, when I had absolutely no sermon, and if any of you have to perform a sermon every week, you know that there are weeks when things happen and you actually don't get to it. So you stand up on a Sunday morning and hope that something will come out that is meaningful and give them something that they can take away that will help guide their life on Tuesday morning. That happened one Sunday, and so I went in and I went through the first parts of the service, and when it got to the sermon, I stood up and I told everyone there what I believed in a way that was not couched in metaphoric language, that wasn't using imagery that could be understood in a different way, that wasn't using words that had a dual understanding, like God. I didn't want people to think that when I said God, I meant a supernatural being that was going to intervene in our lives and make things good for us and promise us goodness, no matter what happened, would make things good in the end. I didn't want people to believe that that's what I understood. And so I had to be clear about what God was. And so on that Sunday, I was probably blocked from it before, I stood up and I totally took apart that God, disemboweled it, and laid it out for everyone to see. I don't believe in an interventionist God. I don't believe in the virgin birth. I don't believe that Jesus was the only Son of God. I don't believe that he died for our sins. I don't believe in any of that. This I have to leave behind. And then I sat down, somewhat shocked that I'd actually come out with all of that clearly. I think they might have been a little shocked too. But I picked up the bulletin, because I never really know where I am. Eric, hear me. I picked up the bulletin and I looked at the next thing I had to do, and it was the prayers of intercession. I had to stand up and ask that God, who I just said I didn't believe in, to intervene in our little service and promise to make good the things that needed to be good and heal the things that needed to be healed. I could have left the church at that time. Maybe I should have left the church at that time. But I went to the people who led that congregation and I said, look, I'm here by your grace. And I can't lead like this anymore. I thought I was having a spiritual breakdown, but it was really just a leadership crisis. I couldn't lead like that anymore. I still believed the same way I'd believed, but I couldn't use the language. I couldn't perform the rituals. I couldn't use the symbols in the same way I'd used them before. Things needed to change. And they said, okay, well, what's it going to look like? Where are we going? I didn't have an idea. I didn't know where we were going to go. So they said, okay, let's go. And we've been on that journey for the last 12 years. What we have now is a community that stands for love, for compassion, for beauty, for truth, for goodness, for living and dying to be a force for good in the world, to bring about change. We've let go of the idea of God as a source of all goodness, which it only is really in the liberal mainline denominations. God can be the source of pestilence and strife in many fundamentalist iterations. But we let go of that God as the source of all goodness, and God as the agent that's going to bring that goodness to you if you believe properly, if you act properly. And we let go of the promise, which was probably the hardest thing to let go of, that somehow, no matter what, good things will come about. About 6 months ago, I found a walnut-sized lump in my abdomen. It wasn't a big deal. I've had lots of cysts before. But by the time I had an ultrasound, I had to be referred to an oncologist. And by the time 6 weeks ago, we had that little walnut taken out, it had grown to the size of almost a 2-liter bottle of pop. And half of it was a malignancy that I was told was ovarian cancer. I had to go through the whole process of figuring that out without an understanding of a God that was the source of all goodness, the agent that would make me well, and the promise that no matter what, things would be good. I had to do it without that source, agent, and promise. But I had something else that my community holds and offers to all who come to it. And that they do and that they can is why I'm still in the church, because I think the church needs to be a place where community can come and offer the kind of support and love that I've had over these last 6 weeks. A week ago, I found out that it wasn't ovarian cancer, it was endometrial cancer, a different kind, not nearly as invasive. And when it comes back, it's years down the road, and it's where they expect it, so you can find it. If I believed that God was the source of all goodness, I would believe that God had healed me for some purpose, that God had rid me of that cancer so that I could do something great. But I have to rely on a different understanding. God as source, agent, and promise, SAP, doesn't exist anymore. We still have SAP, but it's Homo sapiens. SAP being the Latin root for the word wisdom. It's about our wisdom, and that we bring it to the places that it is needed in this world. Whether you believe in a supernatural theistic God or not, bring your wisdom to what it is that that being offers. Or bring your wisdom to the situations that you face so that you can choose to offer into that situation the most good that you possibly can. I know there are arguments about whether or not there's such a thing as good, relativist arguments that everything is kind of neutral and we get to name what it is. But I'm going to come down on one side of that. I think that good is the best, biggest, broadest empathic response we can possibly put forward in this world. Beyond just caring for ourselves and caring for our families and caring for those in our religious communities and caring for those in our schools or our hockey team supporters or our nations, or even just for people, but bringing an empathic response to all life in this world and living that response in every way that we can. I call that impact, bringing an empathic response to impact the world. If we can find ways to build impact into the world, then I believe I can maybe fall down on that side of optimism that Moses offered us this morning. There's an awful lot of gray there, Moses, by the way. But I'll come a little closer to optimism if I know that you and I and everyone you know is working to build impact into the world, an empathic response that will impact the world positively. If I know that, then I will be able to live with more confidence, with more security, with more hope. Even more hope than I may once have had in a supernatural divine being who is going to intervene in my life and make me whole. I believe that communities are places where impact is developed the best. First, in our nurturing family communities, we are born with 15% of the neurons in our anterior cingulate that we need to flip our thought processes forward to our frontal lobes, where we can sit down at that conference table and weigh the odds and figure out who it's going to touch and who it's not. 15% of them. The rest of them grow if we're in a nurturing and empathic environment in the first 8 months of our life. And after that, they're strengthened by the environments that we create around us. The church knows how to do community. It may not yet know how to do community that nails the ideals by which we should live, not on some being up in the heavens, but on our own hearts, and calls us to live them out. But if I have anything to do with it, it's going to learn how to do that. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.